See you again.
Hi. Hi, Tom. Nice to see you again, too.
Okay,
nice
so this is what your scrutiny panel for the second time around.
It is indeed.
The second term. Okay.
Absolutely.
We're just going to go through kind of what you have said in your document. Some of it's quite loosely based around it, and some of it's like quite strict to it. So I guess we're going to start like,
of course.
I normally like follow like the document quite nicely. So I guess where we could start is your PG, your postgraduate summer.
Absolutely.
You mentioned that every month you're going to have a slightly different theme.
Yep.
Could you give us an example of, like, say, what we could see throughout those months?
Of course, 100%. So the easiest one to talk about, I suppose, if you want confirmed, planned, and set answers. So June is currently what's being worked on. Admittedly, most of the work coming up to the PG summer has been very plan-based. It's been ultimately getting university engagement with this scheme. Luckily now the head of student experience is fully on board. The divisional student success and attainment managers are on board, as well as the experience teams, and officially the sort of subgroup of that, because it originally went through the student experience committee. There's now been a formalized working group made outside of that because it proved too big for that one meeting. But ultimately that means the planning phase has just begun in swing at the moment. June is the focus of that. So I can tell you the headline event, which will be, or the opening event, I suppose, which will be the researcher conference. Every year prior to this, the Graduate Research College have done what's called ultimately a research showcase. And it's mostly given PGRs the opportunity to demonstrate their research to other PGRs, which is fantastic. But it has good engagement, but it's minimal in terms of the amount of PGs accepted. With the researcher conference, I've been working quite closely with the GRC on this particularly. I believe the date is set for the 7th of June. So that is officially when the PG summer will kick off in full festivities. Possibly a little before with something cheesy and openy. But the researcher conference will be this year. We're hoping to expand it. We are in the process of hopefully getting Sibson, the sort of Sibson foyer as the hold for the conference for the day. It'll have different sections. We want to make sure as many researchers as possible are given the opportunity to demonstrate their research, build that research community and network, so to speak, but also make sure it's open to not only postgraduate taught students, but also third-year undergraduates, to make sure not only can they, A, explore the research that they're interested in, that students are currently making, B, sort of give them the opportunity to see what a PhD is like, and for the PGTs, it gives them a real opportunity to see if they are going into further study, because I imagine by this point they probably will have secured their position.
They would have already applied for a PhD if they're postgraduate, so that would be a master's. So
absolutely. So yeah, the PhD would be the next step. They probably have it in set, and it gives them a real chance to possibly meet some of their future colleagues, but also see a bit more of what kind of research is available, because I think the amount of research that comes out of our PhDs is remarkable. There's so many different niche, fantastic topics, most of which I admit, especially if they go anywhere near STEM or sciences, go completely over my head, but nonetheless, incredibly fascinating. So that is as it stands, the only event that has a firm, set, and confirmed date. So I believe the early plan is we want to have a minimum of 2 events per week to make sure that it keeps the momentum going, and keeps everything flowing. As for July, essentially you can expect is, I know from the Kent, so the divisions will hopefully get on board with doing events, hopefully collectively as well, but of course in their individual segments as well. But for social activities, there'll hopefully be subsidized trips, especially to Thorpe Park, places like that. Make sure we've got them on the board. So lots of fun things, hopefully. No confirmed yet, but I'm happy to, even if you want me, and you can liaise and I can give you updates, perhaps even bi-weekly, of what's been planned, what's in. There'll be endless amounts of
How are you going to be getting this out to the PGRs and the PGTs?
So I believe the comms plan will start in hopefully May, I believe is the plan, just after the Easter break, where it'll just highlight that the PG summer is coming. I'm currently working with our marketing team at Kent Union to make a sort of logo, so it will be very clear, very visible that this is the PG summer. There will be a events calendar, not only on the university's website, but also on Kent Union's website. Planning to send it out, of course, via emails, the usual routes. The Graduate Research College will be sending out on theirs. We'll be sending out on Kent Union. The divisions will hopefully also be sending it to their students. So it will be bombarded with PG summer. And then the calendars should hopefully give clear events. I'm hoping to make the calendar a bit nicer. This is touch wood if we have time.
Oh goddamn! Do we have wood?
We don't have wood.
No. The floor. That's laminate.
There's some wood there.
Okay.
Yeah. So yes, hopefully. I've lost my trail of thought saying touch wood. Yeah, hopefully we can make that calendar as well really easily accessible and visible. So with June having the focus, of course, on employability progression, what's research culture, so to speak, making sure that that's almost clear, perhaps even color coordinated so you can see it, what it is. Then July month, the more social student experience side of things, with finally August being wellbeing. And to give examples of events you will probably see in the August section of wellbeing drop-ins, as well as sort of drop-in coffee socials that of course be funded and free, hopefully. There'll be sort of therapy pets, the usual sort of, I'm going to make sure as well in August I have as many hours accessible as possible for students, even if it's just a chat, if it's just a talk over whatever. If it's to do with issues, I will do my best to try and solve those, because I imagine especially as a lot of master's students coming to the end of their dissertations, or PhD students, if they're, I mean, obviously vivas can happen anytime, but if they happen to have aimed for a September finish, making sure they've got as much support, as much access to me, as much everything as possible during that month. And fingers crossed, student support and wellbeing will have a huge sway in this, which coincidentally we've already started on with. There's the ILP deep dive currently undergoing, so the independent learning plan for PGRs, because I suppose, let's be honest, having...
Did you have one?
Yes, exactly. You can have an ILP as a PGR, but right now having an extension on an exam isn't particularly helpful. Having more time in exam or an extension on an essay doesn't help in the long run. So we're looking into actually a way of making ILPs feasible and useful.
What would that kind of look like? Because I myself have an ILP, carried over from my undergrad, now doing my PhD. It's kind of there, but like,
of course,
well, this is the Viva day.
This is actually something, hopefully, to consult with PhD students on. I'm lucky enough to have a collection that I regularly speak to and communicate with. But generally opening up that consultation to PGs. My first meeting with SSW regarding this is next Monday, off the top of my head. So that'll be the initial push, finding out, and then I imagine there'll be a consultation phase afterwards, which now you've told me your secret, I will be immediately getting in touch with you. But ultimately, yeah, making sure that we make them appropriate, useful, and helpful for PGR students. Moving forward in terms of specific methods, I suppose, yes, it is a tricky one to do, but ultimately not just offering, we can give you an independent learning plan that's then completely useless.
But something achievable that is going to help.
Perhaps even if it's drop-ins for student support or regular checkups by student support and wellbeing, more training for supervisors that are willing to take on students with ILP students to make sure that they're aware and accommodating appropriately to the students. It'll probably be on a lot more of an individual basis, I suppose, because the sorry, I forgot the word for it, lesser amount of PhDs we have compared to our undergraduates, PGTs, everything else. It should be hopefully a lot easier to tailor a more independent solution to their needs.
Sounds great. I guess we're going to move quite well on to what as soon as you finished, you got re-elected recently, and you went away and did some consulting with Medway, Paris, and Brussels, and you gained some feedback about student experience. How did that go? What did you learn?
Well,
what do you want to tell us?
Brilliant, in fairness. So Medway, I have been generally working with from January. It was something that I believe we highlighted in the last scrutiny panel, that it was an area I need more focus on. So I've been attending things like the Medway roaming forums to make sure that's ultimately where we just literally go to the Kent buildings on the Medway campus and chat to everyone and anyone who is there and willing to have a discussion at that point. From Medway, particular feedback I got was from a large portion of international students. The issues with the registration process and generally it being slower. Before you're registered, you don't have access to campus Wi-Fi's. And if you're an international student as well, and you haven't yet acquired a SIM or something that can give you that connection, you're ultimately stuck completely with no communication, with no way until this issue is solved. So something that I know, I believe it's either Lupe or Zed as well, have been pushing is making sure that these registration process and arrival processes are as smooth as possible. Within the university, that's led to, I don't know the exact name of the team, the student experience team,
Yeah.
the top leading versions of those.
Mhm.
That's now been moved to the internationalization team, which is a mouthful, to make sure that those students are more immediately greeted by something friendly. That's been applied to Medway as well. Aside from that as well, from our Medway students, particularly PG students, they wanted to feel a bit more part of the University of Kent at Medway, so to speak. I believe this is something that's identified both with undergraduates and postgraduates generally, that there's almost a disconnect between being a University of Kent student and being a Medway student.
Yeah.
And so making sure there's almost more of a presence on that body of Kent, making sure that those students immediately are greeted by not only sort of the student union at the hub, but also active participants of Kent unions such as myself, to make sure they're not only supported, known about, building up the community. I mean, the PG network this term actually held one of our first events at Medway to make sure that they were included. It admittedly didn't have a huge turnout, but it did have a decent enough turnout that we, have at least, we've started the legacy of creating events there and having a presence there, which hopefully will continue firmly into the next
How
year.
often do you end up traveling to Medway? Would you say, like in a given term?
So in a given term, this term so far, I have traveled there twice. I'll be traveling there again next week as well, possibly the week after. And I probably will try and fit in another visit as well as that. So ultimately, hopefully once a month as a minimum is the plan. Next term, still discussions on who the lead Medway officer will be. But I'm perhaps going to try and throw my hat in the ring to not only sort of force myself via sort of obligation to make sure I engage with that campus, but also maybe even spending 2 days a week on that campus to make sure that I'm accessible to the postgraduate body there, which is particularly growing at the moment with the university strategy. Brussels and Paris. Sorry, I realized
the international bit of the tour.
Yeah, the international bit of the tour. So that was actually last week. I traveled to Paris on the Wednesday, Brussels on the Thursday, back to Canterbury on the Thursday evening. So it was a busy trip, but fantastically insightful. In Paris, they highlighted some of the issues. So Paris, a bit of community space, I suppose, is the issue. They currently study in Reed Hall, which is owned by the University of Columbia and rented out for their students, which means particularly the Paris Society had some sort of issues with having a space where they could have events.
Yeah.
I've been liaising with the administration team there, and they are working towards an appropriate solution to that, usually by sort of hopefully negotiating with Columbia that after a set amount of time, students shouldn't have to rent rooms ultimately to use them. So they can have evening activities in a space that's sort of safe, familiar, and doesn't require any external funding. However, linking the two in with one of the issues that perhaps was the most clear was ultimately their access to support as international or students on international campuses. So particularly the two factors that we played that into was mental health support and extensions on assignments.
So how does that carry across from, say, like if you're a Canterbury student and you carry across and you go across the water, how does that transition? Do you get the same support?
Of course. So yes, yeah. So theoretically, students in Brussels and Paris should have access to all the facilities that a Canterbury, as in Medway, should have all the facilities that a Canterbury student does. In practice, this is of course limited because any face-to-face interaction with members of staff at the Canterbury campus is basically not impossible, certainly, but Teams and hybrid approaches to that have made it accessible. The main thing that we found, or the main issue that was highlighted, was the knowledge of these services. So particularly with student support and wellbeing, none of the students that I spoke to were aware that they were entitled to counselling and could look into those routes, and it didn't matter that they were in Paris or Brussels, they were able to get them. The other side of it was to do with extensions. There's a particular sort of push in as we know as students here, when gaining an extension, there are factors that may not be easily provable. For example, if your mental health's declining, and it's just in a really bad position, or you have whatever it is that's thrown you off kilter. It's quite easy to get a week extension in Canterbury. In Brussels and Paris, there is quite a firm opinion, at least amongst the students, that if they do not provide a doctor's note, they will not be able to get an extension on assignments. Now, this has wider implications. For example, if you are in those countries, you will have to pay to see a doctor, which means you're ultimately sort of hindering factors. You're hindering their cost of living support by sort of making them do that. But also, it makes the process seem a lot more daunting. It makes it a lot less accessible, and it almost seems like getting an extension is a last resort and a punishment, as opposed to an acceptable thing to do, because life happens. It throws its things your way. So looking into that and liaising with the I'm afraid I don't know their official title, but liaising with the head of those schools ultimately, who manages both of those. We've already had early discussions about this, and we've had some differing opinions, I admit. So there's more discussions to be had in that.
What were these differing opinions based on? Was it more on the requirements of doctor's notes, or was it more broad spread, like widespread?
It was mostly in this instance. So we actually have a fantastic working relationship, me and this individual, which is really helpful with liaising with these campuses. With the parts we particularly butted heads on were the doctor's notes in particular. That they have quite a strong belief that if a student can't prove they need the extension, they shouldn't be granted it. Which I think there's some conversation to have there about invisible disabilities, and the fact that we're in a bit more of an accepting environment than I think we were perhaps a decade ago.
Yeah, 100% agree. So in your feedback, you were talking about how emails and other services could be provided to postgraduate community after they have left, after they become alumni. So some of the viewers at home might not always realize is, like, a lot of us do research as a main bulk of my time here. The email is almost always attached, and most of the time for some students it is their Kent email. And so once you leave, those connections you can often make through your research go. And I get you sadly found out that you guys had a plan towards this ultimate. What's the software called? Sweet.
So it's Illuminati, but spelled alumni-arty.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That weird. Yeah.
Yes.
And how that didn't end up going through. You talked about that you guys are continuing conversations and trying to work something out. Can you give any insight into what that might look like?
Of course. So the two approaches we've analysed at the moment, the first of which was Illuminati. It's such a weird name, isn't it? Yeah. The main issue with that, truthfully, and it was actually one of my main points that I put my foot down on, was pretty much they allowed you to transfer your email. The only issue was I can't quite remember what the end of the email was. I can't remember the exact title for it, but you know how we're .ac.uk?
Yeah.
It's swapped to either a .org or .com, which the main issue with that is, first of all, whichever one it was, I think it was .org, it has a higher chance of being filtered into spam.
Okay.
The main issue I had with it, though, was the cap they had on the amount that was available. So the university would pay for this software, and then it would go and be accessible to PG students to an extent. There was a hard cap on the amount of storage space you were allowed to have emails. I think it was something minimal, like 100 megabytes, which realistically, if you've done 3 years of research, 100 meg is not enough to transfer those emails over. And ultimately, first of all, to a different email, because it would have a different sort of title. But there was a premium membership that students could purchase on their own to allow that cap to be raised, which there's no reason to add additional cost to the students that would be considered what I consider as a bare minimum of if we're invested, or if the university are investing in something to be accessible. The other option that's being discussed, but I think is being rejected by the university, unfortunately, is just sort of continuing to have these emails, store them on a sort of, ultimately not shut them down 6 years after, progress it for a year. That's unfortunately seen as financially unsustainable by the university. So that idea has also moved on. As it stands, they were the two key points of discussions in the meeting so far. We're still having regular meetings, and I believe you're sort of so the meetings consist of myself, another member of the academic team at Kent Union, one of the interim directors of the Temple One Library, and IS as a result, and usually one delegate of the Graduate Research College, to make sure that we sort of fit everyone in there. Luckily, with the interim director of with the Templeman in that meeting. It sort of allows us to skip a lot of the usual bureaucracy with the kind of university system. The downside to it is it means the meetings are fairly irregular due to the sort of busyness of those schedules and trying to get them in. I'm hoping that we can find another solution, be that software, be it perhaps pushing the university to reconsider their decision of it being financially unsustainable. But there's more to come on that one, unfortunately. I think it's going to be a long-winded project. I'm hoping that I can finish it. And fingers crossed now I've got another 18 months.
Yes,
it's quite a while. I'm hoping that I can make get that done. And at the very least, create a legacy that whoever is in after me can continue on and eventually we can see the difference.
This is our last question. So, something that isn't directly mentioned in your report, but something following on from the UCU strikes that are currently going on. One of the main fights being for precarious contracts that some of the postgraduate community, including myself, are under. Have you? I guess the question could be: have you done anything to improve this with students, or see any way of tackling it?
So, admittedly, when it comes to the contracts of postgraduate students, I've liaised and consulted a lot with GTAs and HPLs, or graduate teaching assistants, and hourly paid lecturers.
Yeah.
As for work in the field, I haven't yet made any steps towards it. It's something that you're right. I probably, in fact, almost certainly should look into and make sure that I'm sort of moving forward in that. My main work with, I suppose if we categorize this as almost cost of living support in a sense, that I've done with students has been the UKRI stipend increase. However, looking into contracts is something that I can see is absolutely a necessity. And if you don't mind me outing you, so to speak, as a member of UCU, and
I can speak from experience being like an hourly paid assistant, like teacher. Like I take over seminars. And I have another job where I'm a technician. Those are hourly paid, yes, and also my contracts stay at any given. So for my teaching job, the hours are set quite hard and fast. However, for my other job, there is no hours given to me. I get told, which I'm very thankful for the job I have, but for the hours, they're not guaranteed. There is no guarantee to any of this. And so, say for instance, you become aware of something that comes on. Oh, by the way, you might lose your job. Saying that does happen, right?
So I suppose is it not just in the PhD sector? It's for other student staff generally.
Right. But it's a more general question, but it does affect a lot of postgraduates because most of us come on that kind of contracting.
Absolutely. In fairness, something that I did work on very, very early on is my days as a sabbatical officer was I had a bit of a passion for student staff rights, certainly as a sort of former member of the Woodies myself. In the wider university context, I haven't had many discussions in that sense. However, I can say within the Kent Union context, myself and the trying to think of their title, sort of director of Kent Union Licensed Trade, which handles Woodies, venue, Canvas, or Co-op, all of the sort of retail.
The Kent Union outlets.
Which, of course, we hire a massive amount of student staff. We discuss ways to make that better and make sure that they were.
So those contracts are 0 hours, or are they?
So they're 0 hours with a. So I can tell you, for example, from a Woody's perspective. So they're 0 hours with a minimum of 2 shifts a week as a guarantee. Oh. Now we discussed the idea of actually having fixed contracts instead of 0 hours, but there's 2, I guess, key issues. The first is, I guess, going back to something we discussed earlier, life happens, so to speak. Forcing students into a certain amount of hours can take away certain stuff like exam, or it can have hindrances on exam leave. It can reduce the amount of staff that can be hired. It can sometimes stop student staff being able to have the flexibility that they have within Kent Union. But I suppose this is a very Kent Union specific side. There's now also meetings with the Directorate of Cuttle, Kent Union Licensed Trade, and supervisors within those outlets to make sure that they, almost as well as their manager, they have a point of call higher up, which they can actually discuss issues they may be facing in the workplace, be that disputes about anything from pay to their 0 hour contracts, or contracts to rewards or benefits from the job. In the wider university context, it's not something I've tackled yet. But but it's certainly something
on the list.
Yeah, certainly something to look into and investigate, especially given that, yeah, if you're facing a position, no student should have to face a position where they're given an ultimatum that A, they can be fired at any time with no cause, and B, that they're not able to get any hours in the job that they're contracted for. With Job Shop, sorry, last thing, because I know I'm sort of tangenting onto several things. With Job Shop in particular as well, one of their kind of key values is they do not advertise employment to students that is seen as unfair or unfit for purpose.
What would they view as unfit for purpose or unfair? Would that be a 0 hours contract with no guaranteed hours, or would that be a contract that is precarious?
It would be with any employer that had ultimately mistreated their staff or abused students, not physically, well, I mean physically too, but not,
Right.
sort of abused student labor in whatever form and context that may be. So if there is someone, I guess a prime example would be Deliveroo. Deliveroo obviously has 0 hour contracts, and there was, I know it was a year or two ago, but there was huge disputes over the fairness of how that worked, and you would never see a job like it, sort of for a delivery driver, being advertised at Job Shop. So it will always be fair jobs that offer fair contracts and wages to students for using that. Well, they're advertised on or directly employed by that service.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Ben, for tonight. That was our Scrutiny panel. That's it. Thank you so much for watching.
Thank you for having me, Tom.
No, thank you.